Hi, this is Emily Brand,
And this is Mallory Smith.
and this is our presentation on Criterion-referenced assessments. So what does this mean? Criterion-referenced measurements compare a person's knowledge and skills against a predetermined standard, learning goal, performance level, or other criterion. The score is then compared directly to a standard and not to other students' performance. This is much like the height of others in line at a ride doesn't affect your chance to ride.
Now, this is the late Robert Glaser. He was a psychologist and he initiated criterion-referencing measurement in 1963. The measurement measures not just what students knew, but how well they were learning. Now, this is one of the articles that we analyzed, and it was comparing and not really contrasting, more having them compatible, the two different measurements that we were focusing on. So it was interesting to read that combined, they avoid grade inflation and provide useful information to educators, employers, and learners. And there's the 4 essential domains that I found through the article. So the first domain is grading and feedback loop. This basically just means that they need to be consistent with the grading rubrics and criteria and giving positive feedback constantly throughout the process so the student knows how they're doing. The second domain is subject-specific criteria, which means for each subject, the intended learning outcomes need to be stated as part of the curriculum, exactly what the teacher wants through the grading rubrics and the criteria. And then the third is the quality assurance process. This is a healthy balance between the two reference assessments. It basically checks the guidelines, which I'll talk about next, and make sure that they are being well understood. And then the fourth and final is the institutional-wide narrative guidelines. This is basically the grade distribution guidelines. They need to be adopted and they need to be uniform across all institutions. So the next article we decided to analyze basically was the criterion-referenced approach to student ratings. So there's 4 dimensions of teaching quality. First is organization and feedback and structure. Organization and structure is the extent to which the course is organized around learning objectives that are clearly communicated to the student. The instructor remains true to the learning objectives during the duration of the course. It also involves the clarity of the instructor's presentation, grading procedures, and assignment due dates. The next one is assessment and feedback. Assessment and feedback dimension involves the alignment of assessment and learning objectives, the frequency of measurements, the timeliness of information reported to students about their progress. That would be the feedback. There are 2 assessments. There is the formative, and that is basically self-evaluations. These are typically not graded. And then the other ones are graded, and they demonstrate the understanding of the learning objectives by the student, and that is summative assessments. The next one is personal interactions. Personal interactions is basically student-teacher interactions, and they should enhance the learning, the quality and timeliness of communication, and then And they also mentioned sincerity and concern for the student by the instructor, which I found interesting. Then the final one is academic rigor. Academic rigor concerns teaching practices that enrich the learning environment, and they use technology to enhance this learning. They typically are culturally responsive and promote long-term learning and critical thinking. Criterion-referencing approach to student rating instruction is a viable way to describe teaching quality and help instructors refine and facilitate course development. And then the last article we decided was basically a half a century wasted on this measurement. So there were 4 areas of confusion. Basically, when Robert Glaser started and initiated this, there had been 4 areas that we just didn't understand and have been doing wrong. So the first one is the idea that there are criterion referencing tests. Now we say tests, and it's not an actual test. It is more of an interpretation of the test taker's score. Typically, criterion referencing is when the student is tested and compared to their previous tests, but it's not an actual test. That makes sense. The second is the word criterion means basically it ties down the skills of knowledge being assessed so that teachers can target instruction. The third is optimal grain size of a criterion domain. Now, I do got to be honest, I had to research this. I really didn't understand it. So I finally found that teachers have not been focusing their tests on a reasonable number of instructional assessment targets and objections. Basically, if there's too many or too little questions, it skews the results, basically. And then the description of what a test is measuring. Criterion referencing measurement revolves around clear description of what the test is measuring. If teachers possess a clear picture of what their students are supposed to be able to do when instruction is over, those teachers will be more likely to design properly focused instruction. In other words, teachers do not describe the objectives being assessed in practical languages. So it's how the student basically how the student interprets the objections and the assessments. The teachers are not describing it well enough for the student.
And then the website that we came up with was from renaissance.com, and it's basically talking about the difference between criterion reference versus norm reference tests. The differences are not often in the tests themselves, as Mallory said, it's rather in the way the score is interpreted. Criterion reference testing shows how students performed in relation to criteria and not how they performed against their classmates. This means that an average score is not indicative that the student falls in the middle of his or her class's scores, it's just average against a set of criteria. And in this type of testing, a student's performance category, like proficient, advanced, it doesn't change regardless if they are a top or low performing student. It's only against themselves and their previous scores. Instructors must monitor students' growth in relation to peers, as a constant score of proficient may not mean they're keeping up adequately. It just means that they may be staying proficient as they were before on the criterion reference style. This is where the norm referencing becomes important to make sure they're keeping up with the rest of their classmates, because criterion referencing is often not enough to know if they're staying up to par. Norm reference test shows how a student performs in relation to a specific group, but it doesn't indicate whether a certain criteria was met. Again, this is why having grading criteria that is both criterion referenced and norm referenced comes in handy, especially when repeat tests are done, say a test in the fall and the spring. Then the instructor can gauge how a student does personal growth wise and against the rest of the class. And since both are being used at the same time, some tests can have criterion reference and norm reference results. And in fact, this is often the best way these tests can be reviewed. Here are some social, ethical, and legal issues. Mostly they're all social. I couldn't find many legal issues to do with these type of tests. There's a risk for a negative washback effect, and this is where education material is augmented to fit the test, basically teaching to test. And this just basically encourages students to memorize facts and not be able to critical think. There's also a decreased meeting of high-order objectives, which prepare students for higher education, and this means that there's a lack of a holistic education and difficulty when they get to higher grades. Basically, if they keep taking these same standardized tests in the fall and spring and there's only minor changes, they're learning the same things over again that, again, don't enable them to critical think. They're just learning to test. And there's cutoff scores that are determined by experts on what should be known by students, not necessarily what was taught. This means that sometimes students taking these tests are never exposed to the information, which is kind of the opposite of the negative washback effect, but they just go by a criterion saying students of this age and this grade level should be able to know this information, and it may not be taught in that school. And sometimes cut scores have been set in a way that maximizes the number of low-income or minority students who fail the test. Whether or not this is intentional, it definitely is an ethical issue involving these criterion-referenced tests, because it seems that minority students and those of low income are set up to fail. And then in addition, wealthier schools usually have higher scores, which leaves little area for them to improve if they keep taking the test and consistently receive high scores. Then what's the point of retesting them whenever they're obviously showing that they can do it and they're just regurgitating information that they keep learning? So that was our presentation on criterion referenced and norm referenced comparisons of assessments, and these are our references, and thank you for watching. We hope you learned some things.
Thank you.